is Christina Cobbold, who is here from the University of Glasgow. Christina got her degree in 2001 in the other Scottish city, in Edinburgh, with Jonathan Sherritt, and then moved to Alberta as a postdoc with Mark Lewis. That's where we met, and we've been in contact ever since, and had a lot of fun writing papers together and doing stuff. And then Christina got the position in Glasgow in 2003, and has been there ever since. Very successful. Now, she started out in wound healing modeling, but then she went into ecology and some evolution and a mix of the two, so she knows a little bit, well, actually a lot of everything. And she gives wonderful talks. So Christina, I'm very glad to have you here.
Well, thank you for Jocelyn, Robert, and CAIMS for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. So actually today I am going to talk about a mixture of two, a bit of ecology and a bit of evolution thrown in. So actually there's a few pictures here. I don't know if you can just about see them at the bottom of the slides. It's actually some shots of Glasgow on a sunny day, which is not the norm. So it's usually with rain, but it can look like this. And the work that I'm going to talk about today, that was work that I've done with everyone here is actually at Glasgow. So Daniel Ballas, he actually started off as an engineer and then we lured him over to macrobiology. And Louise Matthews, she's a mathematical modeller, but also an epidemiologist at Glasgow. And then Mike Steer, he's an immunologist, so he does a lot of the experiments and spent a lot of his career doing experiments related to sheep immunity. So I'm going to talk about whether sheep cheat. Okay. So, actually, yeah. So let's okay, great. Oh yeah, that works. Okay, so the sheep that I'm going to be talking about are the ones that you see in all the farmers' fields, so just like sheep that we farm with, and essentially every sheep you'll come across are infected with these guys. So T. circumcincta. So these are nematodes, or in other words, little worms that live in the gut of the sheep. And all of our sheep will have these infections, and they're quite a big economic problem. So, for example, in the UK alone, they cost £100 million per annum just to treat them. So often the sheep are put through dips to try and deal with the infection. There is some attempts to vaccinate as well, but it's basically they're resistant to a lot of the drugs now that are being produced. So these nematodes can kind of are resisting the drugs, and this is a problem. So the question is if we can increase our understanding of the system, could we help deal with this nematode problem? So there is some promise of maybe vaccination as a possibility to deal with this worm problem. But it is expensive, it's limited, and so we want alternative solutions. And so one of those possible alternative solutions is selective breeding. So there's a lot of selective breeding that happens with sheep anyway, and could we selectively breed the sheep so that they have better immunity to these worm infections? So to give you an idea of how many worms sheep have, so on the bottom axis here is the worm burden, and this is number of sheep that have that worm burden. So what you find is if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, that most sheep don't have that many, but they do have quite a lot of worms, and there's usually quite a lot of sheep that you see over on the right-hand side of the graph that have really high loads. So a few sheep carry most of the worm burden. Okay. And so the question is, could we do selective breeding so that all the sheep have less worms, so that they've got better immunity and then are carrying less worms, so basically shift this graph along. Okay. So the reasons that have been floating around of why this might not be possible are to do with trade-offs between, if you do selective breeding for immunity, then you might have to pay a cost. So an example of that is that maybe if you increase your immunity to these nematodes, these worms, that might make you less resistant to other diseases and other parasites. But there's increasing evidence to suggest that that's not the case. Okay, so that you wouldn't necessarily pay a cost and then be more susceptible to other diseases. The other common explanation for this that's given out is to do with co-evolution of the parasite and the host, so like a bit like an arms race. The sheep tries to improve its immunity, the parasite evolves to be better at attacking the sheep and establishing in the sheep, and this game continues. But again, the evidence for that seems weak, because when we look at the parasites and we look at phylogenetically distinct parasites, then they all have similar molecules on them in terms of being recognised by the immune system. So that would suggesting that the immune system can recognise all of them. So this arms race probably isn't happening. So the other hypothesis, which is the one I'm going to get to, is related to maybe there's a trade-off between immunity and growth. So that if I invest lots of resources as sheep into having a strong immune response, then that's going to impact on the growth of the sheep. Okay? And so farmers would be concerned about that. So if that's the case, then selective breeding wouldn't be good, because then although we'd have sheep with less infection, they would be smaller, and that's not what we want either. And so there's definitely evidence that there is this trade-off between growth and immunity, but it seems quite weak, because there is data to suggest that sheep that have very low egg counts of the nematode, so contain very small amounts of the nematode, are correlated with being big sheep. So there is evidence that you should be able to have low amounts of the infection and still grow well and be a big sheep. So then, what's going on? Why don't we see more sheep with just a few of these nematode parasites and having strong immunity? It seems it's possible, so why don't we see it? And so that's how my title comes in. And so our idea is that maybe the sheep immune responses are cheating. So what we want to ask is evolution actually been optimizing the immune response, or have we in fact maybe got suboptimal immune response? So have these sheep actually could do a bit better than they actually are? So to tackle this, what I'm going to do is draw on some ideas from game theory and evolutionary game theory to try and model this system and get at that question. So I'm going to take some ideas, as I said, from game theory and evolutionary game theory, and then couple that with our epidemiological model of the sheep nematode system. Okay, and then that's going to lead us to an evolutionary model of our system, and then we hope to basically find out, well, do we have optimality of this immune response, and if not, would selective breeding allow us to do better? Okay, so before I actually show you the model, I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap of some ideas from game theory, so that you can see where this idea of a cheating sheep is actually coming into play. So usually game theory is kind of reserved for kind of people and decision making and strategic interactions. But I'm going to show how you can actually take that idea and apply it to the ecological setting as well. So the idea from game theory that I'm going to borrow is related to tragedy of the commons. It's not quite tragedy of the commons, but close. So let me remind you of what that is. So here's the setup here. So I'm just going to think of two farmers here who are sharing some resource. So for example, it could be some crop field that they're sharing, and they can both graze their animals on there, but they're sharing it. So if one farmer overgrazes it, then the other one suffers. So that's the setup. So the two farmers can choose to either moderately graze their animals on this field, or they can be greedy and put all their sheep on there, and then just take as much of the resource as possible. Okay. So the question is, what should the two farmers do, given that each farmer gets to choose separately what decision to make? So if we start off here, and so I've got to make a matrix of payoffs. So this is what each farmer gets from making their different decisions. So you'll see like pairs of numbers in this table. So the white numbers are what farmer 1 gets from playing the game with farmer 2, and the blue is what farmer 2 gets from playing the game with farmer farmer 1. So if we look at the top right corner, we see that both numbers are 3. So what that means is that if both farmers play moderate strategy, in other words, put their sheep on the field, but not too many of them, are kind of quite fair in how they're grazing their sheep, then both farmers will benefit and will get a payoff of 3 from doing that. Now, alternatively, if both farmers were quite greedy about what they did and tried to put as many of their sheep on the field at the same time and overexploit that resource, then we get the bottom right-hand corner of that table. So we find that both farmers will get a payoff, but it's now lower, they only get 2. So they do worse if they're both greedy about using the resource. Okay, they've overexploited it. And then on the 2 off-diagonal entries, it's this intermediate case of one farmer is being greedy and the other is playing a moderate strategy. And what we find there is the farmer that plays the moderate strategy doesn't get as much as the farmer that's been greedy about using the resource. Okay. And so the idea of the tragedy of the commons then is that the optimal solution is this top right-hand corner, where both farmers are moderate in their use of the field, because then you're not over-exploiting the resource. But what actually happens is So what actually happens is that the farmers won't end up playing this optimal strategy. So what actually happens is, if I'm farmer 1 here, and I'm trying to just decide what to do, okay? I don't know what farmer 2 is going to do, but I'm trying to make a decision about what I should do. Now, if I play moderate, then if I'm playing a moderate farmer 2, then I'll get a payoff of 3. If I play, if farmer 2 is playing greedy, then I only get a payoff of 1. Now, but if I change my strategy, and as farmer 1 I play greedy, then I do much better, regardless of what farmer 2 is doing. Okay, if I play greedy, then if farmer 2 is moderate, I get 4, whereas before I was getting 3. If I play greedy, again, and farmer 2 is playing greedy, then I get 2, which was again better than what I got before when I was playing moderate. So this says I should clearly switch, and my strategy should be to play greedy as farmer 1. Okay. So what should farmer 2 do? So let's do the same thing with farmer 2. Right. So farmer 2 is playing against farmer 1. So farmer 2 could choose the moderate strategy. Then if farmer 1 is playing moderate, it will get a payoff of 3. Good. If farmer 1 is playing greedy, then it only gets a payoff of 1. Okay. But if farmer 2 instead switched its strategy and played greedy, it would do better. Okay, regardless of what farmer 1 was doing. If farmer 2 is playing greedy, it would get a payoff of 4 if farmer 1 is moderate, and it would get a payoff of 2 if farmer 1 was greedy. So it does better regardless of what farmer 1 is doing. So what we conclude that farmer 2 should also play greedy. Okay? So we concluded the best for each farmer when they're playing selfishly is to go for the greedy move. And what we find then is that this is actually what's called the Nash equilibrium, if you've come across game theory before, but it's not the best solution, it's not the optimal. Okay, so now you can maybe see where this idea might be going and how this might connect to me thinking about sheep immunity. Maybe sheep immune systems are playing some kind of similar game where there's an optimum, but because they're kind of acting selfishly, they're maybe not at that optimum. So keeping that idea of the tragedy of commons in mind, we're going to take that and transfer it to our sheep system. Okay. So the idea here then is that when each player acts selfishly, they overexploit the resource and they're not actually getting what's optimum from either of them in terms of their payoff. Okay, so these ideas have been around for a long time and they've been gradually brought into the world of ecology and epidemiology. This is an example of a recent paper from 2004 by Chris Lausch and David Earn. And so they were using similar ideas of this tragedy of the commons that I was talking about here with vaccination. So the idea then is if there's the slightest risk of associated to vaccination, then what you'll find is that people will act in self-interest and you'll never get the situation where you'll get complete eradication of the disease because you'll get this idea, for example, of herd immunity, where, well, if everyone else is vaccinating and that's lowering the risk of the disease, why should I vaccinate when that might be some risk to me, because maybe there's some other consequences. So then you get the individuals acting selfishly, and then that's detrimental for everyone. So the ideas have been already translated to epidemiology. And then Daniel Rankin, he wrote a paper where he was also looking at other biological systems. He was looking particularly at viruses and whether the same ideas were happening there, and was finding that there was a lot of these recurring themes of cells and organisms free-riding or cheating when there's some kind of shared public good involved, like the way the farmers have this shared field. So this idea occurs in a lot of systems where there's somehow some idea of individual selfishness, then sort of it makes things worse for everyone, and that's sort of the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So how does this relate to the sheep community? Well, for the sheep immune system, it's the mirror image of the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so the tragedy of the commons, the benefits were to everyone. So sorry, to the individuals, because when I'm overusing the resource, that benefits me, but the costs are to everyone else. Okay, so everyone experiences the costs because it's a shared resource, but the benefits are to the individual because they're the individual's one using the resource. Okay. Now, and then what happens in that system is you get overuse of the resource. Now, the idea that we had with the sheep immune system is the reverse of the tragedy of the commons. So the idea then that we came up with was that maybe we can think about immunity as this sort of resource, if you like. And so if the sheep mount a lot of immune response, then the idea is that not only will they benefit, but everyone else. And the reason why is because these nematodes, they end up back out in the environment. So not all of the life cycle of nematodes are in the sheep, but they spend some of their life stage in the environment, and so other sheep will then pick them up, and that's how the life cycle works. So what's happening then is if I mount a high immune response to infection, then not only do I lower the infection for me, but it means that I release less of these nematodes back out into the environment, and then other sheep will pick them up less too. So, but alternatively, if I have a low immune response, not only does that detrimental to me, but it's detrimental to everyone else. So what can happen is an underuse of immunity. Okay, if I'm trying to free ride on the fact that everyone else is producing a high immune response, and maybe I can kind of slack off and not produce much immune response, then hopefully I can kind of free ride on that. But if everyone does that, then we all suffer and there's loads of infection. And so what happens there is rather than an overuse of resource, you get an underuse of immunity. So that was our idea. So maybe there's an underuse of immunity, and this is why we see this sort of suboptimality. Okay. So that was what we wanted to test. Okay. So the idea then is our players in our system then are going to be our hosts, our sheep. Our decisions that we're making is basically what immune strategies should we use. Okay. Our payoff is our fitness, so for the sheep it's going to be some measure of growth. Okay. And then our equilibrium, the idea of the Nash equilibrium in game theory is going to be equivalent to the evolutionary stable strategy that you get in evolutionary game theory. Okay. So now what's the actual model for this? Okay. So we've taken a sheep nematode model from the literature. So this is one by Roland Cow and co-authors from about 2000. And so we modified this a tiny bit, but it's a good model of the sheep nematode system, and it's been parameterized for reinfection. And here's a picture of that life cycle of the nematode and the sheep on the slide. So what we have is that the larval stage of the nematode lives in the soil, basically. And then the sheep will be eating the grass and they'll pick up the nematodes. They'll go through the digestive system and they'll replicate inside the sheep, become adults. And then they'll, basically the adults produce eggs that get pooped out by the sheep, and the life cycle repeats. Okay. And so it's this idea that some of that nematode, that life cycle is out in the field is why what infection one sheep has will have some impact on everyone else because it's controlling what's produced in the environment. Okay, so that's the system, and so here are the equations. So we've got, it's a macroparasite model because some of the life cycle of the parasite is outside of the host. And so we've got three equations. We've got one for larvae, so that's the L equation there. And so the things that happen then to the larvae is that we have some natural decay there, that's the rho parameter, that's just like the larvae have to survive in the field, so there's some mortality associated to that. The beta HL term, that's the sheep picking up the larvae from the field, so H is the number of sheep in the field. And then the last term there, I'll get back to, but that's basically the sheep pooping out the eggs into the field. Okay. So, and then the next two equations are within host, so they're about what's happening within the sheep. Okay. So the A then is the average number of adult nematodes that are in the sheep. So where do they come from? Well, the first term is because they've been ingested by the sheep, they've been eaten, and the P of R there is the probability that those nematodes actually kind of established in the sheep, that they haven't been wiped out by the immune system. The R is the immune system, so that's why that probability, P of R, will go down as your immune response becomes higher. You're going to have a smaller chance as a nematode being able to establish in a sheep with a high immune response. And then that last term there, the mu of A, that's just some background mortality of the nematodes in the sheep. Then lastly, the R equation is the immune response in the sheep. And so again, that's we've got, it's triggered by how many of the nematodes that the parasite is ingested, so that's the positive term in front there. So the more that's ingested, the higher the immune response that the sheep mounts. And then the last term, again, is just background decay of the immune response. And so that's our system. I should just explain what's happening with the egg production, so that last term in the larval equation a little bit more. So the reason that H is there is because A is the number of adult parasites that are in an individual sheep, so H times A will be the total number of parasites, which is, and so each of those are then producing eggs with some success, and that's with some number of eggs, and that's what the lambda is giving, and that's also influenced by the immune system, so that's why there's some R dependence there. So the stronger the immune system, the less eggs that those adult nematodes are going to be producing. Okay, so that's our model. Right, so let's just quickly look at what that does. So we want something in there that tells us what the immune response strategy is. So let's just pop that in there. And so that's coming into the R equation, is that U there, multiplying that positive term. So that's our strength of our immune strategy. So the bigger that immune strategy is, the more sensitive the immune response is to a nematode infection. Okay, so here's just a graph of what that ecological model looks like. So on the axis here we've got time, and then on the y-axis on the left we've got the immune strategy, and on the right the adult worm burden within an individual sheep. And the things that you can take away here, what I've done is I've plotted these graphs for different strengths of the immune strategy, and as we increase the immune strategy, as we go through the colours, if I look at the graph on the right, that's probably the one easiest to start with. Low immune response is the top line, and as I go down the lines, I've increased that immune response. And so, in other words, as I've increased that immune strategy, I've ended up with less nematodes in sheep, which is kind of what you'd expect. The stronger the immune response, the less infection. And then, if we look at the the left-hand graph, which is the immune response, then what you see is as you increase the immune strategy, then the rate at which that immune response increases goes up, although the equilibrium stays, the final equilibrium is the same for all of the strategies, but the rate at which you get there increases with your immune strategy. Okay, so not so surprising, it kind of does what we'd hope an immune response would do. Okay, so Okay, and so what we can see is that if we invest more in immunity, then we have less infection, which is what we'd expect. Right, so now what we want to do then is think about this problem then for multiple hosts. So we're just thinking of one sheep with one strategy here. So before we get on to evolution, let's think about more than one strategy. So I'll take my original model and I'm going to extend it. So now we can have multiple host types, as you see these eyes appearing, which indicates whether this is the immune response and the nematode level for which host. Okay? And also what we see is that in the R equation, the U has now got a subscript I as well, so indicating the immune strategy for host type I. So we've just extended our model to multiple hosts, and then we can ask what that does. So I'm going to look at two types of nematode infection that are common. So the first one is an infection that we actually see, like here it's shown the New Zealand case, but we've also it's an infection that we get in sheep in the UK as well. And so this is a form of the nematode that has sort of moderate worm fecundity. So in other words, those adult nematodes produce a moderate number of eggs when they're replicating in the sheep. Okay, and so what we're looking at here now is a situation where I've got two strategies being played. So I've got two host types, one playing one immune strategy, U1, and one playing another immune strategy, U2. And I've set this up so that the population playing strategy U1 are more common. They're what I'm going to call the resident strategy. So the U1 strategy is the common one. The U2 strategy, there's just a few individuals playing that strategy, a few sheep with that strategy. And then what these colours are giving me the level of the immune response of the invading strategy, the rarer strategy. So the sheep that have this rarer strategy, what's their immune response on the left and what's their nematode level on the right. Right, so if we now, let's look at what happens to this system as we vary the strategy. So along the diagonal in these pictures would be both types of host playing the same strategy. So let's vary from that point. Okay, so hopefully you can just about see the white arrow going up. So what I've done is I've increased the immune strategy of the invader, the rarer strategy. I've increased the strategy. And so what we see, unsurprisingly, is as the shading's going from dark blue up to lighter colour, so our immune response is going up, which is what we expect as we're increasing the immune response. And also we see that we're getting less nematodes in the sheep if the invader increases its immune strategy. So what we'd expect. Okay. And if I do the same thing for a situation of a nematode that has high worm fecundity, so a nematode strain that produces lots of eggs, then I see exactly the same thing. So I see the same pattern. Now, where things get interesting is if I, instead of changing the invader strategy, so instead of changing the strategy of the rarer population, I change the strategy of the resident. So most of the population have this strategy. Now let's change it. Okay, so I'm going to increase the immune response of the residents. That's why the arrow is going horizontally. And so what I see then in the case of the worms with moderate fecundity, then I see, as before, I see that the immune response of the invader decreases. Okay, this is kind of what I would expect if this free riding is going on, because I can benefit from the immune response of the resident population. If the resident has increased their immunity, then that's going to mean less nematodes in the field. So then I should sort of benefit as an invader, because the immunity is sort of being taken care of by everyone else by producing less nematodes in the field. Okay. And that's what I see. But what's interesting is, although the invader population, its immune response decreases as a result of the resident changing its strategy, unfortunately, it also leaves the nematode population in that invading group as going up, which is not what we would hope for if this idea was working. So the resident strategy has increased its immune response. Hopefully, one would hope that that would be good for the invader, that the resident's producing more immune response, so therefore the number of nematodes going into the field is lower, so the invader should need a lower immune response, which is what we see, but we'd also hope that that would also mean it would have less infection because it's eating less of the infected nematodes in the field because there's less in the environment. That's not what we see. If instead I look at the high worm fecundity case, then I do see what I was hoping for, that as I increase the resident's immune strategy, so that the resident is investing more in immunity, then the invader's immune response goes down, which is what we saw before, but also the amount of nematodes in the invader also goes down. So this last example looks like it's the invader is indeed free riding on what the resident's doing, it's sort of getting benefit from that. So the question is, we sort of see mixed responses here about whether we get this free riding or not that we were hoping for with our hypothesis. So the question is, what will we see if we actually put in evolution into this picture? Do we actually see what we would hope for, and that this free riding strategy evolves, or will it not? Because it's not clear what's going to happen here. Okay, so we want to add evolution now into the mix. So to do that, we're going to use adaptive dynamics. So for those of you not familiar with that, let me just give you a little bit of an overview of how it works. So the idea is then that we have some resident population. So most individuals have this strategy, just like I was talking about here. And they will determine the environment that the invader goes into. And so what I mean by the environment then, basically we can think about the resident population as at its dynamic attractor, or in this case, at its equilibrium. So imagine a situation where you've just got the resident sheep playing their strategy, and figure out the equilibrium for that, and that would sort of be the environment that we're talking about here. And then the idea then is we're going to introduce a mutant into that population. So we introduce an individual into that population that's playing a different immune strategy, and then we ask, well, does it grow? Does it invade? And that's basically what adaptive dynamics is doing. So it's basically the idea of invasion analysis. Okay. If I introduce an individual with playing a different strategy into the population, will it grow? Okay. So the key assumptions then with this adaptive dynamics is that the residents are at their equilibrium, okay, because they determine the environment, and the mutants that we're introducing, they're rare, there's not many of them, and the mutation's also quite close to what's already there. So when I introduce the mutant has to have a strategy quite not too far from what was there already. And then I'm asking the question, does that invading mutant population grow? Okay, so how do we add evolution then into our model? So we've got the model equations we've already seen of more than one host type, so that's like having the resident and the invader, host type 1 and 2. And so in order to think about the question of invading, then we need some measure of fitness to say whether that invader is going to grow and be successful. So to do that, we have this measure of host growth that's given by the G equation here. And the idea is that the growth of the host will go down if there's a lot of infection, so if A is high, or if I'm producing a lot of immune response, so if R is high. Okay. And so that's what this equation is telling me. Now you see there's an integral in that equation, and what that is doing is it's allowing us to integrate the effects over a year. So sheep typically reproduce every year, and so we want to capture that effects in the model. So the idea is then what's going to matter is not the nematode infection you have just at one time point, but what you've experienced over the year, because maybe at some points in the year it's been higher than others. And so its effect on your growth is going to be a cumulative effect. So that interval is capturing that cumulative effect. So we're integrating, for example, the nematode levels, the A, over a whole year, and so we would be integrating under one of these curves to get an idea of how much nematode infection has that sheep experienced, and that will impact on its growth. And the two parameters, GR and GA, we don't really know, but those are the parameters that are telling us how costly having the infection is and how costly the immune response is. Okay, so that's some measure of growth that decreases with immune response and nematode burden. So how do we actually then complete the loop? So then we then have an additional equation that tells us how the number of sheep change over time with age. So the idea then is that we're using Volterra to model the sheep in this system. So the idea is that we'll have Volterra competition. So the bigger the sheep is, so if I have two sheep competing, then the bigger sheep will be the stronger competitors. So that's the idea here. So our competition term, the AIJ in our Volterra equations, which is saying the effect of sheep J on the population of sheep I, if J is a strong competitor, then this number will be quite big. So in other words, if sheep J is a lot bigger than sheep I, then AIJ will be quite a big number, and the population of sheep J's will go, sheep I will go down as a consequence because the sheep J are bigger. Okay, so that's the idea. So the growth, the bigger you are, the stronger the competitor you are. Okay. So this equation then for the number of sheep will tell us whether the strategy is going to invade or not, because the more successful, the bigger the sheep is, the bigger it grows, the more likely it's going to mate, the more likely we're going to produce more sheep of that type, and that's how our evolutionary cycle is going to be completed. Okay. So let me just kind of show you that. So then how this gets us our fitness measure. So fitness is usually thought about as the per capita growth rate of our population. So per capita growth rate of our mutants, which is the type 2 here, our invaders, is given by this equation. So it's coming from this Volterra system I've just shown you. Okay. So this first term then in the brackets, that's the effect of the resident, the host of type 1, on the invader, and the second term is the effect of the invader on itself. Okay. So that's our per capita growth rate, which is usually a measure of fitness. Now our adaptive dynamics theory says what we do then to get our measure of fitness is we need to think about the residents as being at their dynamic equilibrium. So if we just looked at the resident equation with no other sheep type in there, what would the sheep number, what's the equilibrium the sheep number would be at? And so we can get that as this K over A1, just by looking at the equilibrium of a one sheep system, if you like. And then the other assumption from the adaptive dynamics is the mutants have to be rare. So that means that H2 is almost 0. Okay? So if we put those two bits of information into this equation for per capita growth rate, then we get our measure of fitness. So this is how fit is our mutant with strategy U2 in an environment set by the resident that has strategy U1. Okay. And so this idea that I'm doing here, it's just the same as an invasion analysis. So really what I've done is linearization, and I'm asking I'm sort of looking at the dominant eigenvalue and asking whether that mutant would invade or not, would it grow in the population. Okay. So this is our fitness equation, and so what we can see is that the mutant will invade. In other words, it will have a positive growth rate if A21 is less than A1. So in other words, if the growth rate of sheep 2 is bigger than the growth rate of sheep 1, it will invade. So that's basically the idea. And vice versa, if the sheep will die out if its growth rate is less than the resident. Okay, so the bigger the sheep, more likely you are to win. What determines the growth of the sheep? It's that nematode infection and our immune response. Okay, so that's our system. So usually with adaptive dynamics, the natural thing to plot is a pairwise invadability plot, which is what we've got here. So on the bottom axis, we've got the resident strategy. the U1. So this is the strength of the immune response of the resident, and then we have the invading strategy on the y-axis. Okay. And so what I've plotted here, on the diagonal, it means the resident and the mutant have the same strategy. And the off-diagonal line, the kind of sort of running through the middle there, that's basically when the fitness is equal to 0. Okay? So it's like kind of pulling a contour. And then to the right of that, to the left of that, I've got positive fitness, and to the right negative, and then vice versa below. So it's just an example of here. And so how do you read these? Then, so what we can do then is think about mutation selection events. So if I introduce a mutant here, because the mutant strategy, so there's the resident strategy is this value, the mutant strategy up here, then because that's in the plus region, it means the mutant's fitness is positive, so it's going to grow. So it will replace the resident, so it becomes the new resident. And then this process can repeat. I introduce a new mutant. If that new mutant had a strategy that was below the resident, so down here, because that would be in a negative region, that mutant would just die out because it would have negative fitness, so it would just die out. So only the ones that have got positive fitness are actually going to invade. So if I introduce a new mutant that's got a slightly higher strategy than the resident, again it's in the positive region, it will invade, and that will continue, and I end up with this spot in the middle where these two lines intersect, and that's the evolutionary singular strategy. And in this case it's also the evolutionary stable strategy, so this is actually where evolution is going to take you as well. So I did then these plots for the sheep nematode system. Okay? So and so what I've done is I've varied the costs of the costs on growth associated to immune response and nematode infection. So on the top row, what I've got is that on the very top left, the cost of the nematode number is much higher than the cost of having an immune response. Okay? And then as I move from left to right, then the cost of the nematode infection is going down and the cost of the immune response is going up until I get to the bottom row here, where now the cost of having immune response is more than the cost of having the nematodes, and then I gradually make it more and more costly to have the immune response until we get in the bottom right corner there. But what I see in all of these pictures is I have a situation where I will go to the evolutionary singular strategy, which is this dot in the middle there. So if I do that invasion selection process I just showed you, then I'll always end up in these dots. And so there's always an evolutionary stable strategy in this system. And what I find then is that if the cost of having a nematode infection is quite costly to have nematodes, then unsurprisingly I evolve to a situation where my immune response is quite high. I invest a lot in the immune strategy. Whereas if actually the costly thing is to have an immune response and having the infection is not so costly, so that's the bottom right, then I don't invest very much in the immune strategy. Okay. So, but what does all this mean in terms of the question of this suboptimal immune response? So let me just skip ahead. Okay, so I'm going to look at 6 real systems here. So 3 types of nematode from 3 different countries. Right? Okay, and the top 2 are situations where the nematodes have quite a small egg fecundity, so don't produce too many worms, and the bottom row, the homunculus ones, are worms that have a high fecundity, so produce lots of worms. So let's have a look at what happens. So what I'd like to know is that we know we get this evolutionary stable strategy, so we know there's this sort of endpoint that the system ends up at, so some immune strategy. But the question is it optimal? So if that's the fitness or the growth of the sheep, is it at the peak, or is it actually off to one side? If it's off to the left of the optimum, then what that means is that I should be able to use selective breeding to increase my U and push it to the optimal, okay? Increase my immune strength. Or it could be suboptimal in a different way. It could be suboptimal because I'm investing too much in immunity, and that's not so good because then I'm investing lots in immunity and I've got low growth. So hopefully we're in this last category on the right where we're producing a suboptimal immune response, but let's have a look. Okay. And any difference between the ESS, which is what we actually observe, and the maximum of our fitness function will tell us how much we could potentially gain from selective breeding. So here is plots of the growth function, so the fitness, for our different sheep, and on the axes are the resident strategy and the invading strategy, and the black dots are the evolutionary stable strategy. Okay. And what we want to do is look at this diagonal line, because the diagonal line is where everyone's playing the same strategy, so that's where we're going to end up with all the sheep playing the same strategy. And the question is this ESS, if we look at growth along this line, is this ESS at the maximum of that growth, or is it somewhere off of the maximum? So if I look at then those slices through that diagonal, then what I've got then is the immune strategy on the x-axis, and then our growth on the y-axis. So what we see actually is in all of the cases we've got a suboptimal immune response. So the ESS is the yellow dots, so all the dots that are on the left in each of those graphs. And the optimum is the dot with the white, so that's the dots that appear on the right. And so what we're seeing in all of these cases then is we're getting a suboptimal immune response, and that we should be able to do selective breeding to increase the immune strategy to get to that optimum. The other thing we see is also there's a difference between these two at the top and the other four. So the two on the top row, the first two on the top row, those are the homunculus parasites, those are the ones with the high worm burden. Okay. So you can't see on this plot, but the maximum is way over to the right. It's way, way higher immune strategy. So actually you'd have to do a lot more, you'd have to increase the immune strategy a lot to get to the maximum. And the other thing we see is that those fitness curves are a lot flatter, so even if you did change your immune strategy, you wouldn't actually get as much benefit. And so in the red here, I'm just showing what potentially benefit you could get if you did increase your immune strategy and tried to move that ESS up to that optimum. Okay, so to summarise then, so this idea of game theory and using this kind of idea of tragedy of the commons, it does seem to be like it might be playing out in this system, or at least working through all the math, it's at least a proof of concept that maybe this is a possibility for what's happening, and that maybe doing selective breeding wouldn't necessarily, for immune strength, wouldn't necessarily be detrimental, but this suggests that maybe you could breed for higher immune strength and not affect your growth. So it does support this idea of maybe this is sort of suboptimal immune response. There are lots of limitations to what we've done. The sheep nematode model itself is kind of is kind of a caricature. We've just thought about one aspect of the immune response here. So our focus has been on thinking about the immune strategy, which is related to the host controlling the establishment of the parasite, so whether the parasite actually gets going in the host. And there's actually two arms of the immune response of this infection, and the other controls the fecundity of the nematode. So in other words, how many eggs they kind of poop out into the environment. So it might be that if you actually think about both immune responses, the story might be different. That's something we've been thinking about more recently. And so the other thing is as well, our model of sort of the host fitness is also kind of a caricature model. Like we've borrowed ideas from Locke and Volterra, when we've been modelling that, and that's something else we've been looking at more recently, is to kind of use energetic models to get better models of describing fitness as well. Okay, right, so I will just stop there. And I'll just thank my collaborators again, so Daniel, Louise, and Mike, and then thanks for listening, and if you have questions, you have to ask them.
Thank you very much, Christina. Let's open this for questions. Great.
Sure. So it seems like you're assuming sort of asexual reproduction. I was wondering when you think about, you have a parent with one kind of gene and another parent with a different, does that affect your invadability analysis?
I think not. I mean, it's a good point. I think the reason for that is because so there is an adaptive dynamics theory when you have sexual populations as well. But I think often they found when they've done the version of with Locke and Volterra, just thinking of the sexual population. So forget about the sheep, but just think Locke and Volterra. Then I think they were finding the evolutionary outcomes were the same. So my feeling is that things shouldn't change too much.
Hi Christina, thanks for a very good talk. You alluded to it right at the very end, so this might give you a chance to explain. If there's a single pure ESS, does it explain the variation in your nematode incidence? Because if they all have, suboptimal, but they all have the same immune response, where does that variation come from?
Right, no, that's a good question. So this doesn't, no. And so actually, the work we've been doing more recently, we think we might get at that. So what we've done more recently is build a much more realistic model of the fitness. So we've written down a model of basically sheep weight that's related to protein intake and so forth. So that's much more based on actually energetics of the sheep. And if we do that, then we find we get the same optimality result, being suboptimal immune response. But what we also get is an evolutionary branching point, so then you get multiple types existing together. Yeah, which
just the second little follow-up point is the biologists mainly have done quite a lot of this type of work where they look at the optimal investment in ESS when part of the work you're doing, like a caching bird, is hiding things. Part of the work it's doing is going to benefit others.
Yeah.
And almost always it's less than what if it was entirely alone it would put much more work in.
Right.
So you mentioned more energetic models. What do you mean by that?
Right. So I guess like sometimes they call like energy budget models where you actually so in our model of fitness we were kind of saying host growth will go down kind of hand waving way because of nematode, it will go down because of lots of immune response. But we can, if we're more specific about that, about what energy is going into the sheep. So in this case, it's like the protein that it ingests through eating grass and so forth. And then you can ask, well, of that protein it's intake, how much does it have to devote to maintenance? How much can it use to produce immune cells, and how much does it cost per to produce each immune cell? And so you can start dividing that energy that's coming into the uses. And so that's what we were doing. So then you can actually keep track of, once I've put resources into weight and immune response, how much have I got left to just grow? And so then you can get a better measure of fitness.
You were showing on the plus and the minus graph.
Oh yeah.
Like this. Yeah, I couldn't figure out what happens on the other side.
Okay, that one. Let me go one. This one.
Yeah,
with the
what
lights.
happens on the right?
Oh, the same thing happens.
You decrease your
Yeah. So on this line, the resident invader has the same strategy. So if I go up the line, so that point there, that means that's the invader strategy, and that's the resident strategy. So the resident strategy is not to change. Now this is in the negative region, so the invader won't grow, so it will just die out, and everyone will be resident. Okay, so I'll go back to the line. Now if I go down here, so the invader has a lower strategy, it's in the positive region, so it will grow. So the lower strategy will replace the resident.
I guess to make my convenience, what does it mean by lower strategy?
just in terms of the immune strategy here, the value of use, so how much you're, so that we can write down there. So this equation for the immune response in the host, and then this was the strength of the immune response, the growth of the immune response, and that was the strategy. And so lower means lower value of this. In other words, you're kind of less sensitive to the nematode. You kind of reduce your immune response. Exactly, yeah. More weak immune response with the lower U and the stronger one with the higher.
So I was wondering, to get to this actual distribution of, it almost sounds like you'd have to do a multi-stage model or whatever. It seems like it's really complicated.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of work, other work on like trying to capture that distribution, explain that. I mean, where these macroparasite models come from is they actually initially write down what's the probability a host has parasites, and then so then you start off with equations like this probability. So this number of hosts with parasites. And then to get to the kind of equations I've got, then you can, for example, what I can do is I can do this. So sum I times dpi dt, and that will give me the rate of change of the average number of parasites in a host. And those are the equations that I was writing down. And to do this involves, at some point you have to do some kind of closure on the system, because you get in terms of what you've got a closer system, you've got to assume something about the mean variance, and so that's what. So you can kind of some of these models actually are kind of implicitly imposing some assumption on the actual distribution.
Good. Thank you very much. And our team has already taken off, so we should be ready upstairs, same place as